I'm Mark Dooley. I'm Global Head of Macquarie's Green Investment Group. We acquired the Green Investment Group from the UK government in 2017, joining the world's first policy-driven green investment bank with the world's leading infrastructure investor. And we now have taken that to be our global business and our global mission in the green space. The Green Investment Group, first and foremost, is a principal investor in projects. One of the great things that we've done since we brought the Green Investment Group into Macquarie's ownership is that we've extended its involvement in projects not only to geographic markets outside the UK and into Europe and now into Asia and the Americas. We've also extended its involvement in projects earlier in the project life cycle. So we development fund new projects before they're even ready to be built. And this is a very significant phenomenon for us and a key enabler for us as a change agent in the low carbon economy in the future. As well as those principal investing products, we also have a number of third-party services that we figure to be really important in enabling the green economy. We provide green investment ratings, which are key in the way this market will unfold. We do advisory for other governments around the world who want to create agencies similar to the Green Investment Bank. Thirdly, we do portfolio and project management for these assets for third parties, helping them to manage and monitor these assets, particularly through the early construction and operations years. Lastly, we're a leading M&A player in infrastructure generally, and we've certainly harnessed the arrival of the Green Investment Group to really drive that into the green asset space, and there's a very strong secondary market trade in those assets. We look for renewables projects that have been well structured, that have the benefit of a robust business case, which could be based on some kind of policy intervention from government, a CFD in the UK or green certificates in other markets, or could be based on a private sector business case where a private sector off-taker has made a sufficient long-term commitment to give us the confidence to move forward. In terms of technologies, renewables continues to move fast. So we're always having to come to terms with new generations of existing technology. In offshore wind, in particular, we see bigger and bigger turbines every time we go out to look at a new project. We're willing to look at brand new technologies rather than evolutions, but the degree of provenness that we need to see in terms of pilot projects is really important to us. The confidence that we can have in the profile of that technology in terms of its performance and the challenges of making it operational, something we spend a lot of time analysing. The cost of capital for renewables projects are driven by primarily macro forces that are driving the wider infrastructure investment market, to be honest. The things that are driving that wider market are overwhelmingly the rising commitment of investors to infrastructure and energy as an asset class within their broader portfolio. And to give you a sense there, maybe a typical allocation, a typical target allocation in, say, US pension funds is 4 to 5%. They've probably got their actual levels in the 2 to 3% range, so they're playing catch up. Whereas for investors like the big Canadians who've been in this space for decades, they're pushing up towards 12, 13, 14% allocation. So you can see which way the trend's going, and that's just on existing volumes of capital. When we then take into account the rising volumes of capital that there are in pension funds and other investable pools of capital around the world, there's exponential growth in the volume of capital coming into these markets. Looking at them generally from an equity perspective, though not exclusively. Turning to the debt side of delivering capital to these projects, the fact is that these projects very much are subject to the forces that create or restrict liquidity in bank project finance markets. When banks are looking positively on the opportunity to get long-dated exposure to high-quality assets, then that's a very good thing for this asset class, and indeed that's been the trend for more than half a decade now. But when that reverses, and at some point I guess it will taper off, then that will make it just that little bit harder to raise efficient capital for these projects. So the falling cost of renewables is, at first blush, it looks like just a progression, gradual good news, making the opportunity to invest in renewables a bit easier and more attractive. Actually, it's now reached a point where I can see very strongly that this is a structural shift that's been achieved. Choosing to create new generation capacity that's renewable now competes very well with choosing to create new generation capacity from a conventional type of generation. So, pick a notional, very efficient CCGT, so gas-fired turbine project. Look at the cost of the power that will produce, taking everything into account. In the right markets, solar will be cheaper than that. So will onshore wind. And in this country, the UK, we're now seeing offshore wind prices that's about level pegging with conventional power. And this is transformative because it means that investment decisions can be made on the technology on its merits with a reducing degree of government policy intervention to cause investment to happen. So this is a very special moment in the evolution of the low carbon economy. Governments and regulators continue to have a really significant role in pushing forward the low carbon transition. To date, there's been a great deal of subsidy intervention, and that's been really important, and we should never underestimate how critical it was and the impact that it's had. And you need only point to the UK offshore wind market to see how strategic enabling intervention by the government, harnessed to strong competitive forces at work in the private sector, can produce something really transcendent. So that kind of subsidy intervention is really important. It's got a huge role and will continue to have a role. And that will be uneven across the world. Some newer countries will require a greater degree of intervention. More mature low carbon economies will perhaps require a tapering degree of intervention. So that's going to stay there. Beyond that though, what's exciting to me is the opportunity for governments and regulators to get a bit of a free kick, relying on the increasing willingness or even insistence of businesses and individuals as consumers of power to form a view and make choices based on the perceived environmental credentials, the greenness of the suppliers that they choose to use or not. We're seeing it already. It's cascading down from the very top, the most sophisticated companies, the largest power consumers in the world, generally switching on to this agenda that it's important that they be seen to source their power from renewable generation. That will cascade down. Each cascade down will require a different shift in the balance of responsibility, the balance of sophistication between what you can expect of the consumer of the power and what's got to be done by the person who would supply renewable power to them to make it easy for them. And when you step all the way down to the mums and dads, then obviously that balance has really got to shift strongly in the direction of the supplier to envelop all of the complexity and deliver a clean energy response that's easy for a consumer, an individual to say yes to. As part of that transition, that shift towards people self-regulating their way towards a greener power market, a greener way of powering their lives, I think it's really important that we deliver to businesses and consumers transparency and standardisation in the way that businesses, energy companies report on how they source their power, how green their business really is. And I think that's sort of at the beginning of a process. Certainly here at the Green Investment Group, we've got our Green Investment Ratings product that we think is quite a world-leading methodology and something that we've standardised across everything that we do. And we feel that that or something like it needs to be really pushed into the world and promoted by governments and regulators as something that's expected. And unless people are using that kind of standardised and quite transparent process, then we should be a little bit hesitant to recognise the green credentials of what's being asserted to us. And I think that's starting to bubble through. When I think about the future of renewable electricity, I must admit I'm drawn to first stop and reflect on what's already been achieved in the barely a decade or two that we've been on this journey. And when I see that it's now a mainstream commonplace for nations and businesses to power themselves from renewable electricity, and that in many markets the degree of investment in renewables far outweighs any investment in conventional power, something really significant's already been achieved. When I look forward, I see a steepening of that rate of investment, that rate of uptake of renewable generation. And I think that's because all of the forces that I can see at work push in that direction. That's the good forces, the fact that renewable power is increasingly user-friendly. It's dispatchable. You can use battery storage or hybrid combinations of different versions of renewables to give real reliability, firm power we call it, or on another version the ability to switch the sun on and off through the combination of these technologies. So that's a really good phenomenon, and that's going to enable businesses and consumers to be an ever larger part of the enabling set of facts that cause renewable power to get bigger and bigger in the future. A big role for businesses and utilities to make it easy for consumers to be part of that. The other force at work, unfortunately, is a bad one, and that is that for all the progress that we've had in deploying renewable power, we're still not on program to achieve the climate impacts that we need to achieve. And I can really see through this next decade that the degree of awareness and frankly real anxiety that there'll be in the community amongst all stakeholders about the real danger that's looming for us will cause a much greater intensity of focus on, well, what can be done right now to shift ourselves away from high carbon power production to low carbon power production.